Hello, AP World History. This is the beginning of chapter 36, which will encompass a really huge part of the 21st century. It will cover both World War II and the Cold War. I'm going to start by just looking at the overall World War II effects. As I'm sure all of you know, this was really a monumental and massive war that truly did encompass the entire globe. It's estimated that 57 million died in this war as a direct result of the war, including 20 million Soviets, at least 15 million Chinese, 6 million Jews, and several million others in the Holocaust as well. So just from the human toll, it's almost unimaginable. This war saw the use for the first time and hopefully the last of nuclear weapons in the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but we will see later how this war actually catapulted the world into developing a whole range of nuclear weapons and very powerful weapons. After the war, the colonies of Europe are going to gradually decolonize and become independent. And post-war reconstruction really is going to divide the world into, you've maybe heard the expression third world before. Well, the first and second worlds were the United States and the USSR. And the third world was actually a term that was used to describe nations, generally smaller and former colony nations, that were not aligned with either the US or the Soviet Union. And Europe after the war would also become more closely aligned with the US. So who are the main players in this war? It's classically called the Axis and the Allies. We see in this picture here, Roosevelt is in the center, Stalin and Churchill, and they represent, of course, the US, USSR, and Great Britain. But also, Great Britain had Commonwealth allies. These are former colonies of Great Britain that were considered still to be part of what they called the Commonwealth. Also, allies in Latin America and other colonies controlled by these nations were all part of the Allies. The Axis, the original Axis, was Germany and Italy. And you can see here a picture of Hitler and Mussolini. And then Japan, here's Hirohito, joined the Axis powers in 1940 in something called the Tripartite Pact. So I call these acts the way that I have them in this PowerPoint because much of World War II is called theaters of war. And so it's kind of like a play, a horrifying play, but kind of like one regardless. So in Act 1, Japanese expansion is fueled by this ultranationalist militarist kind of fuel that I had talked about in our prior message from chapter 35. Excuse me. Japan also lacked resources such as oil and land. I mean, they're basically just a small island. You can see in the cartoon above that Japan basically broke through several treaties that they had made, the Nine Power Treaty, the Kellogg Pact, the League of Nations Covenant, the World Court, etc. And to be honest, they really didn't care. We talked about the Mukden incident, Mukden, in the last chapter, and that was where they blew up part of the railway that they claimed that the Chinese had actually blown up, but they had done it themselves to stage a reason for them to attack Manchuria. And they did indeed conquer Manchuria in 1931 to 1932 and created the puppet state of Manchukuo. I also mentioned previously that Japan does withdraw from the League of Nations in 1933. The invasion was condemned internationally, but as I mentioned before, the League of Nations really had no enforcement authority. So then what happens? The Rape of Nanjing is considered by many to be one of the most egregious acts of aggression on China. This picture here is actually a monument to the victims of the Rape of Nanjing. It is located in the city of Nanjing, and the picture was taken by my son's college roommate, actually. So in 1937, the Japanese launch a military invasion of Nanjing, and this was incredibly brutal. I actually watched a movie about it once, and at the end of the movie, I found myself crying and actually vomiting. I mean, that's how disturbing it was to me to watch this movie, and I'm not going to say the name of it because I don't recommend it to anyone. But it was pure. Uh, just pure horror for the people of Nanjing. The soldiers engaged in sport killing, raped hundreds or thousands of women, and murdered thousands of civilians. And there was no defense that China really had against the Japanese forces that were very militarized and very powerful. One of your assignments for today is going to be to read the Iris Chang article that is posted on Schoology, and I will type these questions out elsewhere. But one wonders, how can someone, how can military leaders get people to um, be so desensitized to killing? And the Iris Chang article that you're going to read talks about the methods that were used. How did the Japanese view the Chinese? How did they see them, or how did they not see them? And indeed, whose life did they deem to be more valuable than their own, and why? So those are things that you'll read about. It is a disturbing reading. I will tell you that straight up. Um, but it is one that is important for world history students to be aware of. Another thing that many people are not aware of is something called Unit 731. Now, many people have heard of Joseph Mengele and the medical experiments done by the Nazis during World War II, but many people are not aware of Unit 731. This was actually a medical experiment facility that was in Harbin, Manchuria, not far from where the Mukden incident occurred. In this particular unit, many types of experiments were performed. First of all, vivisection is basically an autopsy of a live person. So the person would be opened up. They would be given a variety of diseases, and the medical experimenters there wanted to see what the effects of the diseases were on the prisoners. They did frostbite experiments. They also partially froze bodies and dissected them. Part of their germ warfare activity was plague bombs. So they would put the plague bacteria into porcelain bombs that they would drop into cities in China. And actually, there is no way that we can even estimate the number of deaths that were caused by this particular type of germ warfare. They handed out candy with a substance called anthrax on it. Anthrax is a very harmful toxin. My daughter actually worked in an anthrax lab and had to wear a hazmat suit while she was studying the effects of anthrax. And so giving this as candy to children in China and Manchuria. They set up shop in what had been a former lumber mill, and when they brought the Chinese people there that were going to be their victims, they referred to them as logs. They had completely dehumanized them. This was founded by Shiro Ishii. He was a well-known doctor, and by all accounts, he really had no empathy whatsoever. After the war, and this is very controversial to this day, the doctors that worked in Unit 731 were given immunity from prosecution by the USA in exchange for the information that they could get from them. For example, what happens with frostbite. Many, if not most of the doctors or the people that participated in the medical experiments in Germany were arrested, and most of them were actually executed. So this was not the case in Japan. And as I said, there is still to this day some controversy about why that was the case. Um, there is a reading, I believe, attached to the reading that you have on Unit 731. You do not need to read about it. If you want to, that's something that you can do on your own. All right, let's move on from that, if I can. Okay. Chinese, they try to resist, but it's not going to go very well for them. Remember, the Chinese had not really industrialized the way that Japan had. They tried to procure some Western weapons, but they had been so dominated by European spheres of influence that they had really not been able to industrialize on a large scale or build up a massive weaponry. Now, remember, we had the Chinese communists under Mao Zedong and the Guomindang at this time under Chiang Kai-shek. And at this time, they, while they are quite different ideologically, during the war, during the time of the Japanese attacks, they did work together. This would fall apart. And by the end of the war, the communists would gain popular support, and in fact, the Guomindang would flee to what we call Taiwan. Act 2, Italian aggression. So Mussolini invades Ethiopia. Now, do you remember when Europe was colonized? There were two places that were not colonized. Ethiopia was one. The Italians tried to conquer Ethiopia, but King Menelik had been pretty clever and had gotten Western-style weapons and was able to keep Italy from getting into Ethiopia. The second place was Liberia. Well, Mussolini didn't forget about that invasion that was failed in the late 19th century. He moves into Ethiopia, overpowering Ethiopians with modern weapons, and one would think by this cartoon that this would include even the use of perhaps some chemical weapons. 275,000 Ethiopians were killed, 2,000 Italians killed. They also take control of Libya and Albania. And again, the international community says, whoa, this shouldn't happen. But where's the enforcement? Well, there isn't any. And so Italy gets away with it. Meanwhile, in Spain, there is a fascist military dictator named Francisco Franco, and both Hitler and Mussolini support Franco in the civil war in Spain. So this is the end of part 1. Thank you. And look for the reading by Iris Chang on the Rape of Nanjing and answer the questions that come with it. Thank you.